بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. So today we're going to talk about an Islamic critique for secularism, or we're going to watch these kids race around in a circle, one of the two things. Or we can join them, inshallah. Sounds like fun. Inshallah, we're going to get started. But anyway, the Islamic critique of secularism. So why well, first of all, I think I took on too big of a topic, so just forgive me already for the failures in this topic. But why did I think of this topic in the first place? There's a series of issues and ideas and concepts and conflicts that we're dealing with that all sort of have their connection to secularism. And I thought it useful for us to examine this idea. The reality is that 90% more than that maybe, of Muslims live in a secular country. And you may never leave and live in anything other than a secular country. So, in essence, it's a reality that we're dealing with. And in some ways, it's too high of a concept for us to really do anything with. In other words, what can most of us do to change the national character of a society or a country? But in other ways, it's affecting you on individual and a community level in ways that have to be understood so that it can be appropriately dealt with by the community and by us as individuals. So first of all, what was secularism? Secularism was, first of all, in the Muslim societies originally, was an answer to a problem of decline. If you look at the Ottoman state, the Khilafah, the Sultan, whatever you want to call him, and that state, is that they recognized that they had a decline of their society and in terms of development, in terms of power, in terms of achievement, compared to the Western countries that they were competing against. And they sought to modernize the state by introducing aspects of secularism one after another. And so that was originally an answer to decline. Secondly, we have to look, so that was one thing to understand. The origins of this is not necessarily 100% imposed upon the Muslim world. We think of it, sometimes the West imposed a series of values through colonialism, but in fact, secularism started through a proactive process on the part of the Ottomans to try and innovate their way back to success. The second thing I wanted to look at and think about is secularism in the Muslim world. What is the legacy of that? After all, secularism was built in the West, where its origin is, as an answer to religious violence and an answer to the problem of religious oppression. But if you look at the example of secular countries, it didn't really answer the question of violence. Post-secularism, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the Muslim world, there was a lot of oppression done by secular regimes. In fact, you look at how much violence was committed by secular regimes, it really takes it to another level compared to any other ideology before, whether you talk about communism, whether you talk about what happened in Southeast Asia and the different massacres in Africa and Europe, and so on and so forth. it didn't answer the problem of violence, and furthermore, in Muslim countries, it didn't lead to freedom or this great blossoming of society where there was, suddenly all these human rights. In fact, the opposite happened. Secularism often led to more oppressive states. So that was one thing to look at. And then we wanted to examine, or I wanted to at least bring up the fact that secularism in the West had its benefits and also its challenges, meaning it solved some problems, but it left many things that it thought it could solve, it never ended up solving. In particular, the problem of pluralism. There's aspects of pluralism which secularism promises. The idea we'll have a multitude of ideas at the table. But in many ways, many of the secular societies, they didn't live up to the value of pluralism. For example, you can go to any of the communist examples. There's no pluralism in these states. On the other hand, other states had much more freedoms and liberty. Particularly in the United States, there was many different types of ideas and parties. But even in the United States, when it came to the time of allowing the Communist Party to be part of the politic, it eventually became oppressive against the communists. They were banned, they were harassed, they were jailed, until the point where they became extinct as a political party. So it didn't answer some of the questions, but it did provide some benefits. And the last one is secularism in the individual mindset, meaning how has it impacted Muslim societies and people. So I won't go over that right now, but first of all, what is secularism? Secularism is a term. First of all, if you go in the dictionary, the definition, the old definitions for secular, it has no relevance to what it means for us. But secularism basically means a separation of church and state, a separation of religion or religious institutions from politics. That's one definition of secularism. And it was coined by, I didn't know this, but I looked this up, George Holyoake in 1851. And he originally coined the term to try to separate and distinguish his ideas from atheists. He said, hey guys, we're not atheists. Because at that time, it was a big pejorative. Nobody wanted to be an atheist in 1851. So he said, we're not atheists, we're secularists. And there's a big difference. But anyway, that was the original term. And what it means is the public spaces have to be emptied of God and religion, meaning in economic, political, educational spheres, professional spheres, recreational spheres, religion has to be removed from that. So in other words, in economics, or in economic field, your purpose is to gain the most money and leave God out of it, meaning basically. And this is what secularism sort of tried to enforce. And basically they said religion has two areas: private belief and worship, and then engaging in public talk that has no demands on life. Meaning you can talk in public about things that of a spiritual value, but nothing that makes any serious call or demand or action in actual life. So this is the area where religion was delegated to. But there's a second definition of secularism or secularization, and that's the falling off of religious practice. Meaning we say a society has become more secularized when less people are religious. And that is also part of secularism. In fact, you see that many examples in Europe. In Sweden, I just saw this, 4 out of 10 adults who used to identify as Christian now consider themselves atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular, meaning 40% of the Christian population. The UK had a census in 2021. The results came back a bit later, but it was shocking when it came out that for the first time ever in the UK, Christians were less than 50%. And they were down to 46% from 59% before. And the biggest riser as people who were identified with no religion at all. And that was up to 37% of the population. So this secularization was not just the separation of religious from politics, but it was also the falling off of religious practice and religious identification. I'm sorry, did you have a question or you just, sorry, okay. Sorry, I didn't want to miss any question. So falling off of religious practice. And the third definition, and these are from Charles Taylor. He wrote a book on secularism, defining three definitions of secularism. The third one is transformation of society, of a society where it is impossible not to believe in God, to one in which faith is one human possibility among others. And what Charles Taylor said about societies before secularism is that belief in God was a given. It was something that was taken for granted. And that the transformation of society turned into one where it became more of an optional and not necessarily expected thing. So that's another aspect of secularization. So three things. One, separation of church and state. Two, de-religification, I guess, or whatever you want to say, as far as a reduction in religious practice and religious identification in society. And three, the change of a normative value in a society where everyone believed in God to one where it's no longer normative at all. So those are the three kind of definitions. So if religious practice is diminishing, then what is replacing it? And one of the biggest things is the replacement of religion with a different, almost religious institution, which we call scientism. Belief in science as the answer to all of life's questions. And you can see that in many, in this society, you see it in many of the technological leaders, whether you see it in Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or all of the leaders of the IT industry, or even any of the science leaders, whether Bill Nye, the science guy, or I forgot that guy's name, who's into space and astronomy. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. Stephen Hawking, when he was alive. They value science on a level similar to what you or I would think is an ideology, and it is their entire life, and they put their whole belief in it. And to contrast that with Islamic view on science and knowledge itself, what Islam viewed as knowledge was the real knowledge. The knowledge that is actually true is knowledge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And from it expresses, you learn the rules and the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your investigation of natural phenomenon, because those are signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is how Islam viewed knowledge. And the person who has information about certain things or topics but does not have that belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he doesn't really have knowledge. He's called ignorant. And so this has turned into a secular society where knowledge and information has changed its value. It no longer has a value system attached to it. And in fact, it has its own purposes behind it. And what are the values of the person who is God as science? He is trying to achieve immortality. This is what they're all after. I think Peter Thiel, who's the head of this large company, somebody says he injects young people's blood into his body. It's a kind of treatment which people think will make them live longer. And some of them, they feel like they'll come up with a technology eventually that will make them live forever. And so this is really their ultimate value and really what they believe in. And it is a kind of an ideology. I mean, they'll die doing all these sorts of strange things to their bodies. Love of God was replaced by love of nation. So, in other words, you can see how much effort is spent by any country, any nation, on ensuring that the population has a real affection and love for the nation. Just watch any sporting event. How much time do they spend on talking about the nation? How much time is spent on saluting the flag, on Veterans Day, on this, that, and third? And the main point is that the population needs a process by which they develop a love and attachment to the nation. It is not by accident, it is part and parcel of secularism. And that love is that those tears that are flowing in people's eyes are not artificial. They're created by this process and become genuine, so that the love that people had in the past for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or God or that is replaced by secularism with love of nation. The secularism has attached to it a value system which is not necessarily attached, meaning that secularism can exist on its own, but in Western society it's often existed in connection with liberalism. And it doesn't always connect to liberalism. Liberalism is, for example, belief in universal human rights and freedom. But as I mentioned earlier, there are many countries in the world that are secular but have no really attachment to human rights. But in the West, that was an attachment that existed. And, for example, all men are created equal. It has never been a truism, meaning that it's never been like something that everybody in the world accepted, but rather it is a project that the Western societies had engaged on. And, more or less successfully, depending on how you look at it. It is, in other words, a moral project of the American state. But what happens, and certainly Islam has its own view on rights and responsibilities. And if you look at the objectives of Islamic law by Imam al-Ghazali and others, they all talk about the protection of different things of a human being, whether it's protection of their property, lineage, their person, different aspects, protection of their deen. These are things which could be similar to these types of rights, but they're tied up in the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the human being, and they're immutable rights, meaning in essence, the rights exist not just for you or I, but they're universal values that Islam inculcated in the Muslim. Whereas human rights have to be taken by the state and exported internationally, and they do so more or less at their own choosing. So for example, Malcolm X had a very famous speech where he said that, why are we asking for civil rights? We should be asking for our human rights. He said that they're fooled us into asking for civil rights, but we should be going to the UN and asking for our human rights. And the reality is that most places where human rights ended in liberalism was inside of the state itself. Meaning, in the US you have rights, and you can remember this in the war on terror, but they don't apply those rights to anybody outside or who's not a citizen. So if they capture you on the battlefield in Afghanistan, you suddenly don't have human rights. And so if human rights are not universal, then they just become civil rights. They're rights only for the nation. And in reality, that's what's happened in the world. The world, the US and the West, they talked about human rights, but they only ended up creating, in reality, rights for their own citizens, and never ended up on the next aspect, which was universal human rights, even though the UN has this declaration. And the reality is, on the other hand, that Muslims were bound by the values of Sharia, whether they liked it or not. And they could not choose or part and parcel apply these things just because they felt like it or because it was politically expedient. And people would hold them to account for this on a fundamental level, on a legal level, that these are things that are being violated, which because these rights are given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's a fundamental difference between these two concepts, and a fundamental difference in their application. We'll go over that in a little bit more detail, maybe a little later. But another aspect of secularism as a value system, because it not only, these are things which are attached to secularism but may not be necessarily part and parcel of it, but it's definitely the US export of secularism. And it is how it's impacted people today. And that is materialism. So we talked about liberalism, we talked about, this is the second part, materialism. And materialism, if you look at it, I was just in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, then I went to Korea, but you can go to Dubai, you can go to, I don't know, Kenya, you can go to France. If you go into the mall, every place you go into the mall is exactly the same. Have you seen, you know what I'm talking about? It's the same stars that are on the pictures. It's the same values that are being expressed by the store. It's the same ideas and concepts to try to get you to buy more and more. And I recently was watching this YouTube video about a Japanese convert. And he's talking about, he said, this whole society is meant for you to just keep working and consuming. They don't want you to have 1 minute of time to think about anything else. He says, I stopped and thought about, why am I living? This is how he became Muslim. What was the purpose of my life? Is this just it, the whole purpose of my life? And he said, I feel sorry for the people around me because they don't spend even 1 second on this idea. They don't give them enough time to think. You have to earn enough money for the next thing you need. And materialism is a concept, as you can see, is global. It's nothing, and it's not just one part of the world. And in fact, many people will say it's a US export, which is true, but ultimately it became sort of a global phenomenon, part of secularism and liberalism, another aspect. And ultimately, what happens at the end stage of materialism? We have societies, Japan, I like to learn more and more about Japan because it's, as the Muslims who became Muslim in Japan, they tell you that Japan is a country with no religion. Almost, he said, these are the Japanese Muslims who are becoming Muslim. They tell us, they say this about their own society, that we really don't have any religion. And you can see the end stage of materialism manifest itself in these societies because they have things, but it didn't lead to happiness. It led to depression. It led to more loneliness. And ultimately, it leads to a terminal loss of the population. You become more and more individualistic, you become more and more materialistic. Ultimately, you lead to what Japan is, where they lose 800,000 people each year from a lack of fertility, a lack of reproduction. And that is really, they're the earliest signs of that, but all of Western Europe and all of the developed countries are going in that same trajectory. And I didn't mention this in terms of liberalism, but the same thing happens at the end stage of liberalism. Because what happened in this last election cycle, people saw the end stage of liberalism, where you have freedom in everything, and suddenly you had, we had the movement from gay rights until it became part of transgenderism, until it became that they want to export this to people in the kids in elementary school, and suddenly, all kinds of pathologies are being foisted on the population, and the people became alarmed. They said, this is the end stage. The end stage, transgenderism, you cut off the parts of your body that are responsible for fertility, for your ability to reproduce. I mean, that's part of the end stage of that disease. And ultimately, that's the end of any population. Any species relies on reproduction. And when you get to the end stage, it's a total dead end, a genetic dead end, and a dead end for society. So another part and parcel of secularism that leads to a dead end, really, quite literally. And that's why you had this big backlash, and suddenly one of the reasons why Trump was able to come into power. The other aspect of secularism is that it really focuses on the individual. Ultimately, this is the change in modern society, is that it went from an idea of communalism to an idea of individualism. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. So for example, in the Ottoman Empire, before secularism, they had something called the millet system. The millet system, it had everybody organized in groups. Muslims, Jews, Christians, everybody was according to a communal kind of grouping, and you had different laws, expectations, responsibilities, and things according to this group. The change to secularism is that suddenly everybody is individual and has individual rights and responsibilities, and everyone is a sovereign over their own selves. So, you know, the examples of how this differs from Islamic values, for example, if you are an adult male and in individual society, in American society, if your father, for example, is disabled and homeless on the street, do you have any responsibility for your father in America? Legally, you have no responsibility because he's an adult, you're an adult. It's an individual responsibility, individual society. Maybe you could say this is some kind of moral, you know, people might look down on you for that, but they wouldn't be able to hold you legally responsible. In Islamic society, you would be legally responsible because you are not spending on him to be sufficient for his needs, and so on and so forth. And there are these connections also for women, women who are dependent. An extended family could be held responsible for an adult female who is indigent. And they could be legally responsible. They could be put in jail. They could be flogged. They could be fined. All of these things is to understand that Islam thought deeply, and the Sharia thinks deeply about society as a functioning whole. And there's no such thing as an individual who is totally free without responsibilities towards anybody else. Whereas secularism thinks of it the opposite. It guarantees the rights of an individual over any responsibility to the whole. It has a responsibility to the nation, but not to the fellow man. And it's never been enshrined in that way. And so that not only does it create this kind of legal standard, but it became an individual mentality of individualism. And it changed people's personalities to become more individualistic. And so that has its own negative implication. And then one of the questions which we asked in the beginning, but did secularism work? You know, did it achieve what it set out to achieve? Meaning, did it solve the problem of religious violence? And of course, whether it's the Jewish Holocaust or the genocide in Gaza, or whether it's the massacres by Stalin, or whether it's the massacres by Mao in China, whether it's the massacres in Laos, whether it's the Rwandan massacre, you know, over and over again you see violence on a scale never seen before. It did not solve the problem of religious violence, number one. Number two, did Islam, I wanted to compare and contrast, because one of the false claims against Islam is that it was a source of violence for societies. In fact, in India is the number one purveyor of this idea that Muslims came to India and they slaughtered all the Indians and they converted all of them to Islam. And in fact, when you look at India today, what is the majority population? It's Hindu. And Muslims ruled India for hundreds of years, not a small amount of time. And so if we were truly that cruel to put everybody to the sword who did not want to become Muslim, where would there be any Hindus left in this country, or would they be in such large numbers? It doesn't make any sense. In fact, Islam had a very basic contract, which was you accept the dominion of Muslims over this land, and you pay the state a small amount of money to acknowledge this dominion. Number one, that's your acknowledgement. Any contract has what? It has words, and if you look at normal Western contracts, they always have something called consideration. You put a little bit of token money as part of the contract. So there's a contract where there's a small amount of token money, and basically the non-Muslims would declare that the Muslims have dominion over this area. And in return, they would be in total safety from Muslims and from anybody exterior. So both ways. And that was a basic contract. Now, in that way, when the Western traders came in the 1400s to Aleppo and Istanbul, they were amazed by the religious and cultural diversity of these places. They said, how are these so diverse? In our countries, it's all one religion. We can't say anything. We can't do anything. There's hardly any other people there, you know. And they came to this vibrant society, and why? It was because of this contract, this basic contract with people, and it allowed for far less violence in the world than exists today. And in fact, the few massacres that you hear about in Muslim history were very few and far between, and they were always something that was condemned and later on in some way ameliorated. Nothing of this large and wide scale ever happened. In fact, if you want to believe that the Armenian massacre occurred, I don't know the reality of it. Turks will, I'm sure, dispute it. But even that happened under a young Turk movement, which was a secular movement. You know, and so I think the massacres of the modern age of history, by and large, can be laid at secularism in the modern age and in other ideologies. But Islam definitely escaped this kind of mindset towards people. In fact, there's another aspect. We talked about human rights and secularism. You know, secularism in a society tried to reduce cruelty and barbarity. And that's why torture, as a rule in secular societies and in Western societies, is considered barbaric and banned. But at the same time, they allowed the use of violence indiscriminately outside of the country. So for example, I'll give you an example in Somalia. In Somalia, there was a Belgian and Canadian military that tortured some Somalis, and they became, the press found out about it, and they were ultimately like arrested, and they faced charges. At the same time, the US is throwing bombs, destroying whole neighborhoods in Somalia, you know, with civilians. You know, they tortured a few people. They're destroying whole neighborhoods and killing thousands of people. That's considered collateral damage, not a crime. So the problem of violence in secular societies is that it solves the problem of violence maybe for its own society, but in the world, it doesn't really solve the problem. In fact, it gives license to more and more of these kinds of things to happen. So torture may be illegal, but you can torture somebody, you know, outside of the country. You know, torture may be illegal, but killing the whole city is fine. You know, you can't torture one person, but killing the whole city is okay. So these are the kinds of oddities you find in the secular system. Now there are a few things I wanted to mention. I mean, there's a few different scholars that looked at secularism in different ways. In this work, I mean, I did look at a lot of different books. Just give you a few of them just in case people want to read. Talal Asad has a book, Formations of the Secular. Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, is a very commonly cited book. Wael Halaq, Impossible State. It's a new book, Ahmed Kuru, he has a book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment. Sherman Jackson has a book, Islamic Secular. And then this fellow who's pretty, probably notorious for some people, Abdullahi Ahmed al-Naim, who has a book, Islam in the Secular State. They all talked about secularism and Islam in different ways. But I wanted to mention a few of them. Sherman Jackson, his book is Islamic Secular. And in essence, his point is a small one, but maybe of some value. He says that there are activities which the Sharia talks about and is bounded by Sharia, and there are activities where the Sharia is not necessarily in charge. Meaning, if I'm a coder and I'm coding a program, Sharia does not necessarily have anything to teach us about the technical aspects of coding, right? Maybe about the values of what you're coding, but that aspect of technology is not encompassed by that. He said, but that, and that's what he called the secular. He said, but that can be Islamic in a way if your intention when you're doing it is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you seek Allah's help in your endeavors, and you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for success. So you made it Islamic in a sense, you made the secular into an Islamic field. So that was his main point. It's a book, but I didn't think it had that much profound elements, to be honest. He does spend a lot of time critiquing other writers on secularism. And then Abdullahi Ahmed Naim, he's part of this movement, Mahmoud, Muhammad Taha in Sudan. He's a strange guy. He was executed in 1985 by the Sudanese state. But he started saying that basically that the Meccan Quran is what we need to follow, and anything after that, that was just for that time period. So that was his view. But this is one of his members of the party. They had a party called Ikhwan al-Jumhuriyya, the Republican Party. No longer exists, but he's a scholar here. I don't know if he's still alive, but he said that basically we need a secular state, but not secularization of the society. So we talked about that in the beginning. The three definitions of secular. There's that secular state. There's a secularization of society, and the secularization of religious thought itself. And so he basically said that as a Muslim, he feels that secular state is the best as long as the society is not secularized. Another way of looking at it. But I hope that was at least an overview. I don't know if anybody had thoughts, questions, concerns. Like I said, Brother Shem. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about it to some extent in a peripheral way, but Brother Shem was asking about, can you talk about World War II and World War I in terms of violence and number of people killed, in terms of what was the motivation, how did secularism, play a role? And obviously this is way after all these states have become secular. Religion is divorced from all these societies. They've said religion's on the side, and we're either fascist, which is in Italy, we're Nazi, part of the Nazi party, which is in Germany, and then French and British, their own political divisions, and then communists in Russia. So all of these ideologies, they conspired together to kill, the most amount of people in human history to date. I mean, these are the great wars, the World War I and World War II, and they killed people. Obviously, they call it World War for a reason. I mean, even my grandfather in Pakistan was in the war. I mean, this is the reality. We thought he was missing, he was gone. My mom said she thought that we never come back. And so the whole world was occupied in this. I mean, millions of people in India died from a famine, which was created by Winston Churchill artificially. He wanted the food reserved for his soldiers, and the great Bengal famine was millions of people died even though they had the food right there, just because they might need the food for the army. And these are just small examples. Throughout the whole world, millions of people died. And all of this can be laid at the hands of secularism. And it just shows you, just because you eliminated religion from the political system, it didn't solve what you thought it solved in terms of violence. You know, people are violent, and when they don't have any checks and balances on their thought, they have no moral code, they have no moral guidance, they have no higher value that they're working for. Suddenly you lose all sense of anything being right or wrong. And now you don't have any, you're just seeing people as animals, as numbers, and you can kill millions of people without any remorse. You know, that's the industrialized killing on a scale which was never seen before. I mean, maybe the Mongols would have wanted to do it, but they had no capacity. But even they did not have really any religion behind them. So they, again, they didn't really have any moral code against it. So I think that's one of the myths of secularism that has been told to us. That number one, it came from the idea of religious violence and trying to prevent it. And number two, that it was successful, which it wasn't. Yeah. 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 Sure, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot more to this, and I try to be brief because I wanted some time for questions. I mean, first of all, secularism itself is not one thing. American secularism and French secularism is different. Some people call ours passive secularism. They call that active secularism, something rigid or extreme or mild. I mean, there's different ways of looking at it, but you know, for example, in French secularism, everybody should be freed from being able to see any religious, sign. So they don't want to even see that you're a part of a religion. Of course, in Europe, secularism today, and I mean, this is part of my, maybe I should go to my questions. I did have some directions for the future. One of my questions was, will Muslims and Islam be allowed to exist in a Western secular schema? And so think about all of Europe. As Muslims became in larger numbers, suddenly the old ideas of secularism, they were incapable of dealing with this new idea. And so one of the benefits that people say about secularism is it allows pluralism, diversity of ideas. But when Muslims become in large numbers, suddenly that pluralism is no longer a value that people want to retain. Now they want to suppress that way of thinking and that way of living and the way of ideology. So it is a question, is even that main concept of pluralism going to succeed or live on long with Muslims becoming in larger numbers in Western societies? It's easy to be pluralistic if we're all the same religion, the same mentality, the same way of thinking. That's, you can say I'm pluralistic, you want to have a burger for lunch, I want to have pizza, it's okay, we have so many ideas here, but those are not real ideas, there's just facile, superficial ideas, So that's one real difference, real problem, and every Western state has come up with special security laws for Muslims, special laws for Muslims, special, things that discriminatory practices just for Muslims. And so the very idea of secularism, it really is breaking down with this real challenge from Islam. Second, I don't know what else you asked then. Public sphere. Right, yeah, so the way you bring religion into the public sphere, and it's always been there. When we talk about abortion, why are so people so against abortion? It's a religious matter for them from Christian, but they talk about it as a right to life. They change the terminology into a secular language so that they can justify, but its reality behind it is obvious. It's come from a religious perspective. And the same thing happened with some of the Muslim parties in the Muslim world. I mean, they tried to change their names to Welfare Party and Justice Party and so on and so forth, to try and come up with a common language that could exist in a secular, political environment you could talk through. And Muslims, it's easily possible to do that. I mean, you can take a Muslim value and turn it into, a rational justification and then present it that way. But the point is that people see that, and so even those Muslim parties that are in some of the Muslim countries, they got banned. They said they didn't have a Muslim party name. But they know, the establishment knows this is a Muslim party. They're advocating for some Muslim values, and so it didn't matter what the name was. They just banned them. So in fact, that became one of the problems, that plurality of voices does not include, people who are motivated by Muslim values. Even in Muslim societies, that became a problem. Yeah. Yeah. So I think if I had to summarize what Hashem was asking about, why did secularism, when it was implemented in the Muslim world, become so anti-religious compared to European implementation of secularism? Well, first of all, secularism in the West came from a natural process through its own natural transformation. And whereas in Muslim societies, they took it from the West, and this is not, this is not in dispute. Everybody took secularism from the West. And they tried to implement it in their society, so it was something foreign. That was number one. Number two, Islam, as you can see, is so powerful of a way of living, and so many, so strong in invading every aspect of human existence and life, and so convincing towards the human mind that they couldn't convince anybody that secularism was better. So they had to basically impose it. And not only impose it, they had to change people's way of thinking about all sorts of things. Like we talked about materialism, individualism, liberalism. They had to really, in their mind, and first of all, they're also inheriting the colonial kind of mindset. The colonial mindset, whether it was Napoleon who came to Egypt or the other colonialists, is that Islam is a backward way of thinking, and we have to really forcibly move people into modernity. And so we have to really push them. And to do that, we have to, really crack down on all these aspects of Islam. And it happened, in some countries more, in some countries less. It's not like it was universal in how it was done. But even today, that sort of legacy lives on. There's no space in many of the Muslim countries for a person, who starts a party which may have values taken from Islamic understanding. If somebody gets a whiff of this is an Islamic, and it's easy to understand this is maybe an Islamic inspired party or so on and so forth, suddenly that party is facing big trouble. Whereas if they say they take the values from socialism, suddenly, sure, you can join the party. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I think these are some of the factors. Maybe you have some other ideas on that. But. Yeah. Right. Yeah. People should keep not give up hope and keep trying for. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the ways we have to look at it is how do we make, if we're in a Muslim society, how do we make that society more Islamic? And that's one way of thinking about it. And of course, there are theorists who say the nation state itself is is designed in a way which is not Islamically oriented. So anytime, you could, even if you're in charge of it, you have some contradictions with Islam. For example, a nation state is dealing with its own self as a unit. Whereas, Islam, when it takes over as the spirit of governance, it doesn't have this idea of boundary or limitations in terms of space. Its limitations are the people, meaning that the Islamic governance is that who is the citizen? Muslim by default are citizens. And a state, who is the citizen? It is the people of this contained space, whatever that nation is. And that's just one of the many differences, but I think if we're working towards something, a maslahah, something better for people, then I think, curtailing the secularism to something closer to or better than American secularism, something which, you know, after all, secularism some of the versions of it have defined, for example, that there's a national religion. For example, England has a Church of England. You know, that is part of the system. You know, so that could be part of the parcel of that process. It could also be, you know, implementing more of Islamic values and ideas and morality into the system. So I think there are some genuine things to do there in terms of reform. Yeah. I don't know if anybody else had any questions or comments. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, that was the other aspect that I talked about. Really, was that there's the secular, which is the state system, which is separating church and state. But then there's a secularization, which is the mental aspect of secularization, where people become less and less religiously inclined, and they adopt these values, which we talked about: materialism, individualism, liberalism, among others. And these values are the ones that we can actually, you know, tackle as a society, as a community, to try to you know, really change the mindset of people and make sure that we're not falling in these kinds of traps. And they're very damaging, as we said. You know, materialism and liberalism. The end stage is really the destruction of the human being and race in entirety. So, I think, you know, and along that, there's many steps along the way, which are the destruction of the individual as a person, really, in terms of their psyche and their mindset and their life. So I think these are real and legitimate dangers that are part of living in any secular society that is trying to secularize people. You know, and so you have to be cognizant of that process and put in countervailing kinds of mechanisms or movements or activities or education, you know, or cultural awareness, you know, all these things that are part of counteracting that. But. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think we'll end with that comment. But I mean, you know, you look at, they did a study, or I was looking at a study about Muslims, how many of us are retaining over the generation. And in Muslim societies, it's like 90–95% the people who are Muslim will stay Muslim, their children will be Muslim. In U.S. and West, it's, well, in the U.S. it's 75%. So 25% of the Muslims who are born Muslim will no longer remain Muslim in their lifespan. And in fact, the only reason we're growing is that we have an equal amount of converts, you know, that enter Islam. And so we are still growing as an overall number, but the number of people that are leaving is quite large, larger than we think. And then, of course, Before that, is the fact that we're not really doing a good job of really inculcating these values, which are really the Islamic values that counteract these ideas, that are really the antidote towards despair from a lack of material success, despair from a lack of, from too much individual freedom, like what it tells you to do. When you have individual freedom, and we can talk about this in long detail, but you get to do things, and you do things that you want, and eventually you realize they don't cause you any joy or pleasure at the end of the stage, and they just create more and more emotional distress. So, that's something that Islam addressed as well. So I think you're right. We're not really, obviously we're not doing a good enough job for our society in that regard. All right, well, end there. SubhanAllah, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum.